Dr. Williams, it's great to have you with us at our Conservative Leadership Conference. You know, there's a lot of economic misinformation floating around out there. What do you think is the biggest economic myth that's floating around in our society today?
Well, there are a number of them. One is that people think there is such a thing as a free lunch. And I think one of the things that people don't take into account is that the government cannot help one American without hurting another American. That is because there's no tooth fairy or Santa Claus that gives the government, whether it's the federal, state, or local government, there's no tooth fairy that gives them the money. And so in order for a government to give $1 to one American, it must first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. And if anybody thinks that I'm being loose with the terminology intimidation, threats, and coercion, you have until April 15th to check me out.
I know exactly what you mean. What do you think? Our economy obviously is still slumping, no matter what the official statistics say. Our polls show that a vast majority of North Carolinians think we're still in a recession and probably will be for a year or longer. What do you think is causing the economic problems, slowdown, slump, malaise, whatever you want to call it?
Well, I think that it's government taking too big a role in our economy. And keep in mind, there's one thing that Americans do not appreciate. That is, we've gone from 1787, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, until around 1930, and we had recessions, we had depressions, sometimes they called them panics, and nobody thought that the federal government ought to intervene to help out. It wasn't until the Hoover administration and later the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s where government intervened to help out with a recession. And it turned what would have been a sharp downturn of 2 or 3 years into a 10-year affair. That is, it created the worst depression in our history. And so the government does not have a very, very good record of helping out. That is, government has, or politicians have, they have very, very little capacity to do good, but they have awesome capacity to do evil, to hurt an economy. They can't do very much to help an economy, but they can do a lot to hurt. And the kind of things that explain our very slow recovery, it's the slowest recovery in decades, maybe over the last century or so. We have the Obamacare, which is raising the cost of doing business, and then we have the what do they call that, the credit act where they're protecting consumers.
The consumer protection.
The Dodd-Frank, the Dodd-Frank, and there are many government regulations that impede or stifle economic activity. But however, these government regulations are on the books because there are powerful lobby groups in Washington that benefit from these regulations. There's a few Americans that benefit, and there's a large number of Americans who are harmed.
What if conservatives were to be in power, what could they do? Because that's criticisms that's leveled at conservatives. Say, well, okay, what would you do? We can't just sit there and not do anything, although maybe that's the best answer. But if perchance there was a conservative Congress and a conservative president, what could they do to get our economy going again?
Well, I'd urge that they don't do what they did the last time. That is, when the Republicans had control over the House, over the Senate, over the White House during the two Bush administrations, we had the largest increase in spending since the Johnson years. We had numerous regulations. We had No Child Left Behind. We had prescription drugs. So what I think that what Republicans or conservatives ought to do when they get into office is to draw back on government. That is, right now, government, our federal government, spends close to 30% of the GDP.
Mm.
And keep in mind, in 1787, we were a poor third world nation.
Mhm.
And we went from 1787 until the 1920s, became the richest nation on the face of this earth, but federal spending during that interval between 1787 and 1930 was only 3% of the GDP,
Mm.
compared to almost 30% now.
Mm.
And so I think that the reason we became a rich country was because government played a very, very limited role in our society. And we're having all these problems with the growth of government.
The national debt. There was a column very recently, within the last few days, from the Washington Post writer saying, "Oh, we don't need to panic over the national debt." How do you view the rising tide of spending and debt in Washington? Is this a real problem, or is it not a problem?
Oh, it's a massive problem. That is, the debt is a big problem, but the bigger problem is the massive spending.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind, a lot of people like to think that, well, we're running deficits, but in any real economic sense, the budget is always balanced. In the real economic sense.
Mm.
In the accounting sense, it is not. But in the real economic sense, that is, government cannot spend anything unless it takes it from the American citizens. That is, so they can take it from American citizens through taxing, they get through borrowing, and through inflation. And so while we have an accounting deficit, we don't really have a deficit in the real sense. What we have is a concealed deficit. That is what borrowing and inflation conceals government activity. It makes it less visible.
How serious is inflation? Because the official statistics show that it's very low, but I've been reading some experts or commentators feel that the statistics underplay where inflation is really at, or at least its real danger. Is inflation present, or is it a coming danger, do you think?
Well, inflation I don't think is, well, we have a 3%, roughly somewhere around 3% inflation. Now, matter of fact, that is fairly high historically. But recently, it's not very great. But we have the huge potential for inflation. That is, when all this quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve has been doing, loading up banks with cash. Once they start lending out that cash, once the economy starts moving a little bit, we will face the dangers of rapid inflation. And the political problem at that time will be that the economy will begin to turn around, but there will be huge inflationary forces, and the Federal Reserve won't be able to do anything about it, because people will be saying, well, gee, just as the economy is beginning to turn around, the Federal Reserve is trying to put brakes on it through its monetary policy. So I don't know whether the Federal Reserve will have the intestinal fortitude to do anything about if inflation forces rise, but given their record, they won't have much intestinal fortitude.
It is a cause for concern. Speaking of causes of concern, there's been much crowing in the press because the administration says they have signed up 6 million people, which is supposedly a fairly good number. I'm sure you keep track of what's going on with the Obamacare Affordable Care Act situation. Obviously there have been problems. How do you think it's doing right now, and what do you think its prospects are over the next year or so?
Well, I'm guessing and I'm hoping that it will collapse. That is, if you just look at the idea of the federal government being able to force an American citizen to buy something, I mean, I think that has to be offensive to any principles of liberty. But one of the big problems that the Obamacare is facing is that it's not getting enough young people. It's not getting enough young, healthy people to subsidize us older, sicker people. And so And so it's going to be massive problems. And then also, the whole issue of they're signing up, they have to try to get people to sign up because it will be actuarially unsound, much more so than it is now, if people wait until they have an accident and then sign up. They fall down the steps and say, "Give me the phone, let me sign up now." That would be very much like in the fire insurance company for your house, that you wait until you have a fire and then you call and say, "Well, you have to take care of pre-existing conditions. My house is on fire and now I want insurance."
Okay. Another current topic that's been floated, and you wrote about it not too long ago, the administration, the president, and some of his allies are talking about inequality in our society. First of all, do you think inequality, economic inequality, social inequality, do you think it's growing in our society? And if so, what should we do about it, if anything?
Well, I think that it's a rather crude assumption to think that we're all equal in any kind of substantive way. That is, people should be equal in the eyes of the law. Any other attempt to make people equal violates the principles of liberty. And there's nothing to say that we should be equal. I mean, for example, Jewish Americans are only 3% of our population, but they are 39% of the Nobel Prize winners. Then, I mean, that's a gross disproportionality. So, but what should we do about it? Should we take some of the Nobel Prizes away from Jews and give them to blacks, Irish, and Polish? Or another more readily discernible example would be black Americans are 13% of the population, but they're 80% of the professional basketball players and 66% of the professional football players. So if everybody was equal, then you would not expect such disproportionalities. And so I think that the quest for any kind of equality other than equality before the law is a very, very dangerous mission, because if you ask yourself, look, we're going to try to make, just for an example, we're going to try to make Nobel Prize winners equal. Well, what are you going to do? Are you going to take the Nobel Prize from the Jews? I mean, or if we're going to make basketball equal, well, what are you going to do? Throw blacks out, put Chinese in, Japanese in. So I think it's a foolhardy. No, we're not equal, but just because we're not equal, in fact, does not mean that we should not be equal in the eyes of the law.
One of our first speaker of this conference was Clarence Henderson. He's now chairman of the state's Martin Luther King Commission. He's best known. He was in an iconic civil rights photo integrating the protesting at the F.W. Woolworth store in Greensboro in 1960. And he talked about growing up black in the segregated South, but saying he had white friends. His father was self-employed as a mechanic, and people brought their cars to him, or auto shops sent their cars to him when their repairman couldn't fix it. So he was very proud of this, but he was saying that, not to put words in his mouth, he was saying that affirmative action and whatever, and some of the political correctness we have gone through has thrown things off kilter. How do you see that situation? I would take it from your previous remarks that we need to let people compete equally, but how do we address these issues, do you think?
Well, many of the particular problems that black Americans face, they're beyond the government to help. That is, and you can't blame them on discrimination. That is, nationally, 70-some% of black babies are born out of wedlock. That's a devastating problem. It doesn't have anything to do with discrimination, and moreover, the government can't do anything about it. The high crime rates in a number of black communities, it's a devastating problem, but it seems like government's not doing anything about it. Most of the problems that we face as individuals, and particularly black people, most of the problems are caused by government. I mean, I've often said that the welfare state has done to black Americans what slavery could not have done, the harshest Jim Crow and the racism could not have done, and that is to destroy the black family. That is, only slightly more than 30% of black kids live in two-parent families today. But back in the 1880s, I document this in my book, Race and Economics. In the 1880s, in some cities, 75% of black kids lived in two-parent families. In Harlem in 1920s, 85%. So you might ask, well, what happened? And I think that it's the welfare state that has made certain kinds of behavior less costly. And and then in terms of black Americans, I mean, it's always been the government. It's the government that did not protect our rights as human beings and allowed slavery to continue. It was the government who enforced Jim Crow laws around the country, or they allowed extra legal measures to foster discrimination. Look at the government schools where that deliver fraudulent education. That is, a black kid graduates from high school, the average black kid who graduates from high school, he has reading, writing, and arithmetic and computational skills of a white 7th or 8th grader. And again, it's government schools, and or occupational licensing. Where in New York, you have to pay $700,000 to get a license to own and operate one taxi. Again, that's a government regulation that cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. So in my view, government has been the enemy of black Americans throughout most of our history in the United States.
And I know what you mean. If people could just, I lived in Pittsburgh for a while, and there are a lot of black jitney drivers. Unlicensed, unregulated, but just took your car out, drove people around.
That's right. Yeah, and the tragedy is that, and the jitneys are in New York illegal drivers. I mean, they don't have a license. But the tragedy is that here are some people making an honest livelihood, but unlawful. That is, they're going about trying to say, look, if you want to get in my cab, I'll take you to the airport. Nothing's wrong with that. But the government says, no, we're going to determine the conditions.
To move back to current issues, the president is now advocating for a higher minimum wage, and we conservatives feel that's a bad idea. Could you maybe explain why high minimum wages or higher minimum wages are harmful to people and to the economy?
Yeah, well, I think that most Americans support a higher minimum wage, and they do it with, I think, the best of intentions. But when you ask about a law, you should not ask what are the intentions of the law. You should ask what are the effects of the law. And you see the effects of a minimum wage law if you put yourself in the place of an employer, and you must pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire. Well, would you hire that worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that would enable him to only produce $4 worth of value per hour? That is, would you pay a person $7.25 when that person can only produce $4 worth of value per hour? And most employers would look at that as a losing economic proposition, and they just wouldn't hire the worker. So what the minimum wage law, the effect of the minimum wage law, is to discriminate against the employment of low